Um, Tonight we're kind of going to go way back to the kind of the beginning. Um, and we're going to cover a little bit of what Morgan covered, but we're going to dive maybe a little bit deeper. So first off, it'll go forward there. Um, just a broad overview of what we're going to do tonight. We're going to be talking about achieving vegetation management goals. We're going to talk first about choosing a livestock species that fits the goals of the project. We're going to talk about grazing management as a function of timing and season of timing slash season of use, duration, frequency, and the number of livestock for whatever the area size is. And we're going to talk about what it means to remove the optimal amount of target vegetation for a little bit about removing the optimal amount of target vegetation for any specific project. All right, so first off, species selection. As I said, Morgan covered this a little bit last week. He talked about how cattle are grazers, which means they tend to prefer grass. They have a larger muzzle and a large rumen, which means they can tolerate kind of more, lower quality forage, and they have the room to process it and allow the microbes to break it down. Um, they Because of their larger muzzle, they're not so great at picking out specific plant parts, so they're a little non-discriminatory. Um, Sheep are an intermediate feeder. They have a small muzzle. They tend to prefer forbs, but they will eat grass. They do browse a little, but mostly they like to keep their head down when they're grazing. Um, and because of their smaller muzzle, they can graze close to the ground and select specific plant parts. Goats have the smallest muzzle, like Morgan said. They're a browser. They like to be looking up and they love to climb. Most of us are probably familiar with how agile goats are. They have that narrow, strong mouth. They're really good at selecting very specific plant parts that they want to eat. Proportionally, they have larger livers. So we already kind of talked about how they are better at breaking down any toxins or that might be in the plant. They have special proteins in their saliva that can bind some of those toxins. So the goat kind of overall is built to handle that stuff. And they even have some specialized rumen microbes that help them break down some of their toxins. So lots of things about the goat that make them pretty good for some of the brush species that maybe have some of those toxins and other things that make it difficult for other species. All right, so I don't know if anyone has ever watched an animal graze before, but I wanted to watch a couple quick videos so we just kind of see how they actually work. And I'm going to try and mute it because we don't have to have the music. There, it's muted. Okay, we're going to go to 1 minute, I believe. So, as the cow is eating, this is a beautiful cow in Scotland. You can kind of see how she wraps her tongue around the grass and rips it off. And she moves her head from side to side, and then takes a step. And this is sort of like, I mean, this is beautiful grass, right? Like cows would just die for this grass most places. And so it doesn't look like this all the time because maybe the grass is farther apart or they're being more selective. But this is just sort of generally what it looks like when a cow is eating. They have, they have um, all cow, sheep, goats, they only have teeth on the bottom, right? So they're kind of ripping the plant material off as they eat. Um, okay, so I'm gonna keep going past this. No, it does not want to keep going. How do we get past this? There, okay. So here's some sheep. We're not going to get to see how their mouth moves, but it's going to be a little bit similar, though they are able to select a little bit more. But what I want you to watch a little more in this one is actually their grazing behavior and how they're selecting what they want to eat on the landscape. Right there. So if you look, they're kind of in groups, and it looks like they're eating something specific that's in that area that they like. And so when I've been out on rangelands and there aren't any animals there, but I can see that there were spots that the animals were especially interested in. They'll graze like this one patch really low, and then there's tall grass right next to it. And you can see that the sheep are kind of doing the same thing. They're finding what they want, eating it, and then moving on and looking for the next patch of good stuff, right? So just kind of a similar pattern there. Let's see if YouTube will comply. Or the PowerPoint reel. Great. So I thought this was really fun. Ask This Old House did a little section on goat grazing. And so this video is pretty short because they're talking a lot about the whole process, right? But again, we're just going to watch the goats actually pinch some of those leaves off. Um, so where do I want to go? All right. So you can actually watch the goats start to take the leaves off. They're looking for what they want. They're picking out the leaves that they want. Um, we'll get another view here in a minute of a little bit better, just them picking out exactly what they want, selecting exactly what they want off of it. And they'll go through and pick out what they really want, and then they'll come back through and eat the rest of it. And we'll talk about that sort of selectivity in a little bit. Okay. So we're mostly talking about sheep and goats here because they tend to be what's used most in targeted grazing, but obviously cattle are definitely an option. So when you're thinking about species selection, you want to think about size and or breed. So like in vineyards, sometimes smaller sheep are chosen. Um, you want to think about age. So younger animals are going to be more likely to try new things. So if you need an animal that's going to be a little adventurous and eat something that is new, maybe a younger set of animals is better. Um, but so age is going to matter because also sometimes animals have the learned behavior of they know a plant is good, so they'll go straight to it. Body condition is important. Hungry animals are less selective. They just go in and eat. And then the stage of production cycle, right? So it's important to take into consideration the nutritional needs of your animals, if there's any pregnant ewes versus dry ewes or does and things like that. All right. So Grant, hopefully you can hear us over the hockey game.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
how do you match livestock species to forage type? How would you select, cattle, sheep, or goats for a project? I know you don't have to.
So the first thing I do is I figure out like what are our goals, right? Are we trying to focus on like a brush? Are we trying to focus on the fine grasses down low? Are there specific weeds that we're going to try and target? Are they a potentially toxic weed? In which case the sheep are a little bit better for that. Like your leafy spurge and things like that. I know that's really not a California thing, but we try and focus on that. And also, like you said, what stage is it in? If poison oak and everything is really rank, probably looking more like a goat project. If that poison oak is just now pushing and it's real fine, like it is today outside, those sheep will clean that right up. Then or if it's really rank feed with a lot of stock in it, maybe the cattle are a better option. But a lot of that has to do, with the fencing. What are our options? Most of these jobs, uh, the contract kind of jobs, they're not fenced for cattle. Otherwise, somebody would have it leased for cattle. It's very rare that we can get a job and apply cattle to it. We can apply cattle to it on ground that we control. So, I'll run the sheep through and let them eat some of the fines and the flowers and things like that. And I'll follow them behind maybe with some old dry cows or some butcher type cattle. Just something I don't really need to push the pounds on. If that makes any sense.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you, Grant. I appreciate that. I don't see any questions in the chat, so we'll go on.
I guess real quick, also the terrain. I forgot to mention terrain and water. If I didn't mention those, I'd be completely unfair to everything. Uh, there's a lot of that terrain that these sheep will work, and they'll climb those rocks like goats. We got some cliff country, and they work up in that, and they can go on a little bit less water, especially this time of year. We get a rain shower. We can take advantage of some of that drier country, even if it is a job. The water, the needs for water are quite a bit less if we time it right. Sorry, I'll get out of your way and quit interrupting.
Oh, you're fine. Happy to have your input for sure. And yeah, it's a great thing to remember the terrain part. So that's great. Thank you, Grant. Okay, so I wanted to kind of point out the variation in vegetation types in California. So Grant talked a little bit about selecting species for the type of forage. And so basically, there's a lot of different kinds of vegetation in California. Our precipitation goes from less than 5 inches of rainfall in some areas to more than 120 inches of rainfall. So just a huge variation in the ecology and the plant species that you find. There are more than 6,500 plant species in California, so a lot of variation. In most other states, you don't find half that much. And then we also have the tallest trees in the US and the oldest trees in the US, and they're two different species. So just a really diverse vegetation and a lot of things to kind of be aware of on when we're talking about vegetation management, right? And so I told you we were going to go back kind of to the beginning. So I wanted to talk about how kind of the ecological history of California and why plants in California are adapted to grazing. So basically, around 10,000 years ago, there were really large herbivores here. We had mammoths and mastodons, giant bison and elk. We also had the large predators to go with them. We had, a short-faced bears and other bears. We had lions that are extinct now. We had cheetahs. We had some other interesting creatures like ground sloths and tapirs. So essentially, California's been grazed for a really long time. The plants here are adapted to grazing and browsing, and when that management, when that interaction is removed, then something is missing from the ecosystem. So that's why grazing is important in managing the vegetation in California. This is a picture from the La Brea tar pits. So that's just one of the species that was found there. So the other thing is that, the native peoples, we used to think hunter-gatherers didn't do a lot of managing, right? But what we found is that they did a lot of managing of plants and the ecosystem in general. They used fire a lot. They used it to help with basketry so that they could have the right length shoots to weave their baskets. They used it to manage trails. They used it to help with hunting. They would use fire to herd the deer or the grasshoppers. And fire was actually pretty frequent. Um, in some cases, fire was used annually. Sometimes it was maybe every 3 to 5 years. And sometimes it was less frequent, but fire was really frequent on the landscape. And so there really was a lot of management. They did some weeding. They would go out and spread seed by beating the plants to make the seed shake off and spread. So they would create, sort of lush areas of desirable grasses that way. They did selective harvesting of like root sorts of plants. And they would, by selective harvesting, what I mean is they would take some and they would leave some. And in the process, they would sort of till the soil and thin the bulbs. And it was a management style. My mom has irises and she has to go in and thin the bulb sometimes. Otherwise, the plants don't do as well. So they really did manage a lot more than maybe we used to think or learned in school. And then the photo to the right is wild celery. It's a edible green that they used to boil and maybe do some other things with. So they knew how to use all these plants, and they definitely managed the area around them to help produce food. And so really the takeaway is that California was managed and it's been managed for quite some time. Okay, so today in California, our landscape looks a little bit different than it did maybe before the 1800s-ish time frame. Don't quote me on the dates because I don't have them memorized perfectly. But essentially, when Europeans came through, they brought some species with them. And so today, instead of a lot of sort of perennial type plants, we have a lot of annual grasses that actually are not native. And the reason they're here is because we have a Mediterranean climate, which is really similar to the Mediterranean in Europe. So places like Spain, Portugal, Italy, our climate is really similar to those areas, and that's actually where a lot of our annual grasses came from. So they're not native, and they've changed the landscape to some extent, and they tend to produce a lot of pounds per acre, which can cause concerns for native species, but also for fire fuel management and things like that. Um, yeah. So we're going to talk today about some of the ways that livestock can impact the landscape. We're going to talk about grazing and browsing a lot. We're going to talk about hoof action as far as when, when the hoof hits the ground, sometimes it kind of kicks up some dirt, right? But also, when those animals are out there, the goats are climbing on the brush, or maybe a cow steps over a plant, and usually they kind of step around, but occasionally they'll end up stepping on it. And so in that way, the simple presence of the livestock on the landscape can modify what it looks like. Sometimes they'll trample the grass as they're walking through, and they don't tend to then eat that grass if it's been trampled or pooed or peed on. So then that grass tends to stay there and be integrated into the soil, which is good for soil health. And then, of course, urine and manure, whatever they eat, they then excrete, and it becomes fertilizer and organic material on the site. All right, so some principles of grazing management. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but the frequency, meaning how often, how frequently grazing returns to the site. The season, so the timing, are the plants dormant and asleep? Are you grazing like brown grass? Um, are they actively growing? Um, when so,
Children.
did you have a question, Winston? Okay. So like in the spring when the grass is green, like right now, and they're actively growing, that's when the plants are really super nutritious. But that's also when, if it's a perennial species, that's when it's kind of has the hardest impact on the plant. Um, and we'll get back to why that's important in a little bit. Duration. So how long are the livestock there? And one thing to think about is, are the individual plants bitten more than once, and how does that affect them? Stocking rate, so we talked about the number of animals per area unit for pasture, small paddock, whatever it might be, right? What's the stocking rate? Is it high or is it low? With a high stocking rate, the animals are going to be less selective. They're just not able to choose as much because there isn't like the space. It's like having one person at a buffet versus 20, right? You have to be a little more, you have to be a lot quicker when there's 20 people at the buffet to get your food than if you're the only person there at the Golden Corral that day, right? Um, and then rest is probably the single most important factor that can cause change on rangelands, and it's something that I think some people underestimate. You can have too short a time period of rest, and then the plant is still stressed when grazing returns and it hasn't fully recovered, and that can negatively impact the plant. And you can have too long a period of rest, and then the plant just they haven't been the grazing hasn't removed some of the vegetation, and they're not really at their peak because they've been rested for too long. And we see areas that haven't been grazed for a while, and we see the effects of too much rest as well. And then any discussion of grazing management in California would be completely lacking if I didn't mention residual dry matter. And that's residual dry matter is just our fancy word for all the dead grass at the end of the grazing season, which is about September 30, October 1. We've shortened it to RDM. So if you ever hear people talking about RDM, that's what it means. It's all the dead brown grass at the end of the grazing season. And because we have our annual grass, which covers a large portion of California, annual grass is managed a little bit differently because we don't have to worry about um, managing the plant for a long time. Doesn't matter what we do, it is going to grow, die, well, grow, set seed, die, and then come back next year. And so, what the important thing about managing annual grasslands is doing things that protect the soil. So, making sure that there's enough organic matter covering the soil surface when the rains come. They slow the raindrop. They also provide a little microclimate at the soil surface for those little grass seedlings when they first get started. You know, if it rains kind of early in October and then it gets a little warm and those little grass seedlings have already sprouted, well, having some residual dry matter shades them and helps keep them moist so they can kind of live through that drier, warm spell in October. Um, I do want to talk a little bit about perennial plants, in large part because this is going to play in later when we're talking about targeted grazing and meeting project objectives. And so both of these photos came from Holacek, which is a range management textbook. And the picture on the left is blue grama, which is a grass. It's like a short grass prairie species from Texas, Midwest area. And the LG stands for light grazing, MG is medium grazing, and HG is heavy grazing. So you can see the effects of the the stalking rate or the number of bites on the plant, even and how it affects their roots. So essentially what happens when a perennial grass is eaten or the top is bitten off is that it calls on its root reserves for energy to grow back the top. So it'll grow back the top first and then it grows back its roots. So under a heavy grazing regime, it's going to require a lot of roots to grow back the top, and it's going to grow back that top first, and then it's going to have to regrow a lot of roots to then be able to have the energy reserves to be grazed again. And that can take some time. If in under a light grazing regime in say like Oklahoma, where it's more moist and they have sort of a warmer growing season than we do, um, man, might be able to return to one pasture every 30 to 35 days, but that system doesn't tend to work as well in a lot of parts of California. But it's something to think about, right? So grazing affects the roots. And a general rule of thumb is that if you take more than 40%, so about 40 to 50%, the roots stop growing. And so then that affects the plant overall, right? And then on the right side is just another sort of picture of what I've been talking about, that when the plant is grazed, it calls on that metabolic reserve and it uses that metabolic reserve to regrow the top first and then the bottom. So when we're thinking about rest, we're thinking, okay, the plant's going to regrow the top part of it first, and then it's going to regrow the bottom. So we have to think about making sure the plant has had a chance to regrow its roots. Okay, so plants have two primary adaptations to grazing. They have grazing resistance, like these large thorns on this mesquite stalk or stem here. And then they also have so the grazing avoidance, like the thorns, they have poisonous substances, which we've talked about a little bit. And then sometimes they just don't taste good. And that's so palatability, right? They don't taste good, so they're less likely to be eaten. And then grazing resistance, we're going to spend the most time on the grazing resistance portion. Um, So grasses are adapted to grazing, and meristems are basically growth points on a plant. And so grasses have growth points at their base, a basal meristem, and they also have what are called intercalary meristems, which means they have growth points on their stalks as well. So when a grass is eaten, it can actually just continue elongating from one of those intercalary meristems and to continue growing from there. It doesn't have to start back from the base again. So that's one way that grasses are adapted to grazing. Now, it's important to note that the recovery rate for grasses differs by species. So in my reading, as I was preparing, I read about crested wheatgrass, which we don't see a lot in California. Maybe out in Modoc, you might see some crested wheatgrass, or in some of those more sagebrushy areas. Um, it recovers pretty quickly from grazing, whereas there's some other wheatgrass varieties that don't tolerate grazing well at all and require a lot of rest. So the recovery rate's really going to vary by species and how well they can recover from each grazing event. Forbs can have basal-ish meristems, right? They're near the base, but maybe not right at the soil surface. Again, depends on the species. Dandelions, for example, the reason you have to get the root, right, is because if you don't, they will grow back from that basal meristem, which is right at the soil surface, or maybe even sometimes below there. Um, and then shrubs have meristems at the tips of their little stems. And so if you think about a shrub, it's a shrub, so it has meristems kind of all over it. And so its adaptation is that it has a lot of them. So if some get bitten off, it can grow in the other areas that haven't been grazed. And that's kind of where that 40% utilization comes in that, if you eat about, if an animal comes along and eats 40% of or less of the new growth on a shrub, because the new growth tends to be the most palatable on a shrub, then there's still plenty left for that shrub to keep growing and not be really negatively impacted by the grazing. And then just a little note, it's fairly common to have shrubs or like hedges or bushes in front yards. And when they get if anyone's ever paid attention and they get trimmed frequently by a gardener, they tend to grow in on themselves. Well, if a shrub has been grazed a lot and all of those growth points on the outside are removed, it will start to grow in on itself. And so to protect itself, it'll actually start sprouting from branches within the bush so that all the growth points are actually actually physically protected, that it's harder for the animals to get to them. That's a sign that a shrub has been grazed a lot, probably more than it should be. As far as balancing the impacts of grazing, we have sort of three broad categories in the way we think of this. We have increasers, decreasers, and invaders. And so it might be a little bit opposite or counterintuitive. The increasers are actually the broccoli, right? Because if we're given a chance between ice cream and broccoli, we should eat our broccoli, but we had the choice. I know I would prefer dessert first. And so increasers are actually the plants that are less favored by livestock. They're going to eat them second. They're going to go through and eat the ice cream plants first. And those are the decreasers because they get grazed the most. So then with the most grazing pressure, they are more likely to decrease on the landscape. Whereas the increasers have less grazing pressure, so they are more likely to increase on the landscape. And I could not come up with a food analogy for invaders, so I just went with yellow star thistle, but fill in the blank food analogy for invaders here. Um, they're plants that come into an area and they kind of tend to take over. They change the structure and function of the ecosystem and the vegetation that was already there, and often are not desirable. So, yellow star thistle, not desirable, changes the structure and function of the ecosystem and can crowd out other plants. Okay,
Julie,
yes,
there was a question in
oh,
the
sure.
chat. When you were talking about the growth points, what
Yeah.
about legumes?
So, forbs are legumes. And it's going to vary by species. And I have to apologize. I did not look up multiple species to give like multiple examples. I did just briefly touch on alfalfa, which we will talk about later, but their growth points are near the base. They're not at the soil surface, they're near the base. And so when sheep go out and graze alfalfa, there has to be enough stubble that the alfalfa can then sprout again in the spring. So I know, and this is something that Grant can touch on too. There's a, 2, 3 inches is what should be left when the sheep leave. Otherwise, the alfalfa plant can be negatively impacted by the grazing. Um, Grant, did you want to touch on that real quick? How you manage the sheep in
Yeah.
alfalfa?
So I definitely did not go to college and learn all of the technical stuff, but from what we see, it, on the alfalfa, it tends to be a management style. And with the alfalfa producers that we work with, they typically want us to take that alfalfa back to the crown, take it down tight. And the reason for that is it may affect a little bit. It may have a negative effect on their yield by, a slight amount, but the gain that they get by us cleaning that up is worth every penny. Because the blue aphid and all those things are what are really negatively affecting these alfalfa crops. And so by us taking that alfalfa back to the crown and getting it pretty tight, they have a 40% better coverage with their herbicides and pesticides in that field. So theoretically, year on year, they use less herbicides and pesticides to keep those crops clean. And in their first cutting of alfalfa, they don't have any brown leaf. If they have brown leaf from last year's crop, they'll get docked when they send that to the feed store. It won't be feed store quality. So our alfalfa farmers, they all want us to take it back pretty tight. My alfalfa farmer is a firm believer that alfalfa stores its energy in the root, and that the orchard grass stores the energy in the plant. So on the alfalfa, we take it back tight, and he's like, yep, you're good. Let the frost come in and kill all those bugs, and then we'll spray behind you, and we don't need as much out there. Saves them a ton of money, makes the fields better. But then on the grass fields, the orchard grass and Timothy, that's where we need to be careful, and we need to leave 3 to 4 inches of stubble behind. So that way those fields have enough energy to get going in the spring when the snow melts. We have seen that. We've taken those grass fields down a little too tight, and they just don't snap back as quick coming out of the winter. So far on the alfalfa side, we've done everything you can think of to try and ruin a field of alfalfa, and we've been unsuccessful. The only way we've ruined an alfalfa field is by not going and grazing it. There will be people who argue with me, I'm sure. What do I know? I'm just, a dumb sheep rancher. But by not grazing it, there's so many bugs in there. A couple of years ago, there was guys in the middle of the summer when they should have been taking their most productive cuttings, calling us, begging us to send them sheep to come clean it up one time because the aphids were so bad in their fields. And it just so happened to be fields that had not gotten sheep the previous year. Maybe it's all just, chance, but that's what we're seeing on my end.
Great. That's helpful, Grant. Thank you. I appreciate it. So it's definitely going to vary by species, and some forbs or legumes are going to be annual, and so it's going to be kind of the same thing, right? They're going to sprout from seed, they're going to flower, set seed, and die all in the same year. So managing them is going to be different than the perennial forbs, which are less common on the landscape in California, but alfalfa is one really common one for like targeted grazing crop settings. Okay, any other questions? No? Okay. I'm not looking at the chat, so please interrupt if there's anything else. All right. Okay, I have another one for Grant. Have you observed livestock select for certain plant species and avoid other species you might normally expect them to prefer? For example, have you ever seen them like skip fillery or something they might really normally select and then come back to it later?
Absolutely. And is what hit us like a ton of bricks a couple of years ago was we were up in the lava flows out on the east side, over near Paradise, going up into Paradise and all that canyon country. And I had a herder on, I don't know, he had 1,000 ewes and lambs over there. And the grass down low in that more clay soil was big, tall grass, and it looked really good. It was, oats and clover and a little bit of vetch, but more oats and clover, but it was just beautiful. And that herder was fighting those sheep to stay down on it. And those sheep kept fighting him to get up in the rocks and nibble on, vetch that was so small you couldn't even hardly pinch it off with your fingers. And he was like, boss, I just don't understand it. Well, is what, that fillery, it was really sweet right then. I was like, just take a bite of this stuff. You can taste that it's sweet, that clover and everything down low is real watery right now, and those sheep are wanting that sweet fillery up high. So just looking at it, if you were driving down the road and you had to make a guess on which piece of ground you wanted to pay money to be on, 90% of everybody would have picked that lower ground, where really the money was being made up in the rocks. That there was more rock and moss than there was fillery, but it just had a different flavor to it at the time. But then flip the script just a little bit, a couple weeks go by, and we get a little bit of a breeze, and that clover down low starts getting a little bit harder. They all switched it around on him, and he couldn't keep them on the mountain anymore, and they just run down there and started eating that. So I mean, those sheep are kind of telling us stuff, and we've got to really listen to them, because what you expect would be the big ticket item might not be. Same thing has happened with us in yellow star thistle. We've gone into places and there's a little bit of ryegrass and stuff in there. It's last year's ryegrass, but it's still decent in there, and different like Reed's Canary down there along the creek bottoms and stuff. But then you'll have a big patch of star thistle that in the fall, when those spines all fall off, the sheep just kind of quit. They quit all that lower country, and they go over there and start picking around in the black dirt and eating the heads, those cotton balls off the top of the star thistle. My guy's like, once again, I never figured that they'd even go over there. And he's like, I don't think that they're doing very good on that. I don't think that they're going to do great. I said, just give them time, because I mean, that star thistle's 12% protein. Might as well hit it. I mean, it's the best thing we got out there, really. I mean, they put cottonseed in the grains and things that you can buy at the feed store. That's basically what we're dealing with over there. The biggest concern at that point is, are we scattering seeds? Are we making the problem bigger? But we've had a ranch that was solid star thistle, and we just camped a bunch of sheep on there, and we ate all those seed pods, and we did that every year for a couple of years, and just, I mean, took that thing down to absolutely nothing. And now you're kind of hard pressed to find star thistle out there, because the vetch and oats kind of took over, and now we've got enough vetch going in it to where vetch is even kind of pushing that oats out of there. So you'll get the gravelly soil up on the ridges and stuff where the fillery and clovers are still in competition up there. But down in the lower country where that vetch would really rise, we got rid of that star thistle and we cleaned that whole place up. So as far as scattering the seeds, I kind of didn't worry about that anymore. So those things have surprised me in the past. Same with the poison oak. There's times where those sheep will go attack all the poison oak before they even look at a blade of grass. And then as soon as the calendar hits a certain day, they shut off of it and they go right back to putting their head down and wanting to eat the grass. And the bitter brush, all those things. We've grazed up in some pine tree plantations, and we've gone in a little bit early, and those sheep were just trying to nip the tops off all those little pine trees, and we're like, holy cow, who'd have thought that they'd eat a pine tree? Well, then 4th of July rolls around. The day after 4th of July is like somebody flipped a switch. They won't even touch those old pine trees anymore. The wood goes hard, and they get a different flavor, and the sheep just move on, and now we can graze in there, and we don't have a problem. Manzanita. Nothing elite manzanita. Well, I guarantee I've got a band of sheep that will if I get in there early enough. So those things, I'm surprised every day by what they'll do. The thing about my operation is, and tell me to stop when I'm talking too much. The thing about my operation is most of the time, maybe 9 months out of the year, that I have the opportunity to let them eat what they want and watch what they want and learn from that and teach my herders even. Any herder I've got, the first thing I try to do is get them on a band of sheep that doesn't have a fence, because you cannot make them stay somewhere that they won't be happy. Sheep cannot lie, and they will not let a herder lie, and they will teach you a lot if you just watch them. Yeah, we've got to keep them off the highway, but once again, maybe the bottom down here where you think the big gain isn't where it's at. Maybe it's up a little higher. And so by not having those fences, as soon as you fence something in, now they can, like you said, the ice cream and the cauliflower kind of a thing. they're eating all the ice cream the first day and then they're starving to death on the cauliflower for the next week. So by getting rid of those fences, those sheep are always kind of doing better, because if a herder tries to leave them somewhere too long or on grass that's not desirable at the moment, those sheep will just pack up and leave in the middle of the night, and good luck to him. So I think it's pretty neat to have that opportunity and just see what they're doing. And I try and pay close attention to it and write it down on a calendar, to where, like the pine tree thing and the manzanita thing. I try and write those things down. Like, okay, on this date this year, they quit. On this date this year, they quit. And I'm trying to build it in my own mind, so that maybe someday I could save my kids a little trouble. And when they try to go eat in a plantation a little too soon, I can tell them to wait. Maybe, that's just how I'm doing things and what I'm seeing and the opportunity I have. Not everybody has, I understand. But I mean, even in a smaller cell, you can kind of get an idea if they're really happy or not, and they'll surprise you every time.
That's great. Thanks, Grant. That's awesome. Yeah. So, like Grant said, the animals will select what they really want to eat. And sometimes if you need them to eat something that they don't want to eat, that's where we're going to talk a little bit about the art and science of, it's called the art and science of range management, but I kind of think it's the art and science of targeted grazing too, because there's a lot of experience that goes into it and learning how to manage the animals, right? Okay. So, um, the goals are going to vary by project, right? And so sometimes, like Grant gets the opportunity to let his sheep select, right? But then sometimes on some projects, the sheep or goats might really need to eat something that maybe they might not normally select. And so in those cases, their behavior sometimes has to be manipulated. Um, And so we're going to talk about fire fuel reduction. So fire fuel reduction often has to do with either reducing any sort of flammable vegetation, right? So it could be grasses, it could be shrub cover, and so those are going to vary by project, and that's sort of where that idea of where the growth points comes in, is because if you're trying to reduce shrub cover, the goats or sheep can come in and eat those shrubs, and maybe you kind of have to push them to really stress those shrubs. So maybe the shrubs um, don't grow as much the next year or stay the same size or something like that, right? And so that's why I wanted to introduce all those concepts about how grazing management works, because sometimes instead of in targeted grazing, sometimes the goal is to have really um, good grazing management to the point to increasing the health of the ecosystem altogether. But sometimes the goal of targeted grazing is to have a little bit more of a negative impact on specific species. And so how are those goals achieved, right? And how does that work? So that's why I included some of that. For example, in invasive species management, the great thing about yellow star thistle, like Grant said, is that it's high in protein, and a lot of times they'll select it. I remember reading about goats who would go in, and man, the yellow star thistle sheep wouldn't touch it if in this particular project, the sheep didn't want to eat it if it was all spined out. But the goats would go in and just gnaw on those seed heads until the spines got soft, and then they would eat them because they were so high in protein. And then they would strip the leaves off, and all that was left in this yellow star thistle was stalks. And not that sheep can't do that, just that was not what was mentioned in the thing that I read. And I know sheep have been used a lot on yellow star thistle, and so that's just one example, right? And so one of the things about invasive species management, Grant talked about how the sheep went in and just bit off the seed heads. Well, the whole point of invasive species management is to reduce the amount of some specific species, and the best way to do that is to reduce the number of seeds on the landscape. And that takes time. So typically, if we're just using yellow star thistle as an example, and not all species are this way, but yellow star thistle as an example has 2 to 3 years of a seed bank in the ground. And so good control of yellow star thistles, of good prevention of the yellow star thistle setting seed for about 2 years usually results in an improvement, like less yellow star thistle, visibly less, without even doing any sort of scientific counting methods. The yellow star thistle on the landscape or the site that's being treated, right? And so that's something to keep in mind, right? If someone's out and they're looking at a job and explaining things to the potential, the person who has a contract out. It's perspective, right? Like if we're going to treat yellow star thistle, you got to know it's going to take 2 or 3 years to really see some change on the landscape and to for them to be prepared for that. Um, when it comes to cover crops and soil health, kind of grazing more for the goal of benefiting the crop. There's some other things that go into it. That's where really good grazing management is important. We talked about how root growth stops when more than 50% of the plant is defoliated. So typically that's if the plant is actively growing or not like dormant for the winter. When plants are dormant, you can usually take a little more off, but like Grant said with orchard grass, because I did say that every species can kind of differ. Like Grant said with orchard grass, if you take too much off the top, it doesn't have that energy reserve to come back as well in the spring. And so just keeping that in mind and paying attention to the differences in each plant species that is being grazed or treated. And so when plants are grazed, I told you that they use the energy from their roots. And what that means is they slough those roots off and they take the energy, they slough those roots, and then those roots become organic matter in the soil. And that's really important because the roots feed the microbes in the soil, and microbes are really important to soil health. So that grazing, that relationship with grazing and stressing the plant actually helps build soil health. Um, Plant roots also support good soil structure. They actually provide little micro funnels to get water down into the soil, so they really help with water infiltration. There's a symbiotic relationship between the soil microbes and the plant roots. And so when grazing for soil health, that's where uh, the grazing creates helps the microbes and then the roots grow and then they begin to form those symbiotic relationships. And they take time to develop the microbes in the soil and to sort of get that little micro community built takes time and it can be pretty easily disturbed. I read a paper a while back that looked at some rangeland that had been tilled. So it had been, put under plow. So tilling disturbs the microbes and inhibits the relationship between the microbes and the roots. Um, and what happens is that there can be a documented change in the soil microbe populations for decades after a tilling event. So just being aware of some of the ways that our management impacts the plants and the soil and how if someone's goal is soil health, how can animals be managed to help with that? Um, oh, and then just wanted to mention one example of sort of grazing to benefit a specific species, and this could be for lots of different things. But vernal pools are basically depressions in the ground um, where water tends to fill up, and they're not very deep, and they used to be quite common across California. And there's a lot of species that were really adapted to them, and so basically they're filled with water for some period during the rainy season, and that's when the plants sprout, and they're adapted to being covered in water for a little bit, and then as the water recedes in the spring, as everything dries up, then they'll start to flower and go to seed, and that's also where some species of little fairy shrimp live. So lots of sort of little micro ecosystem in those vernal pools. Well, what happened when all these annual grasses came in is that sometimes they can choke out those vernal pool species. So in the case of vernal pools, grazing can really benefit them because they help to keep the annual grass down. We're not going to get rid of the annual grass. Um, but grazing can help keep it down so that there's less competition for those vernal pool plant species. Just one example of grazing for a very specific purpose. Um,
Jill,
okay, Grant.
oh,
Oh, yes.
Jill,
What's up,
can I
Allison?
interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
I just in the chat,
Mhm.
Dan and also Dylan had put in a couple of links
Oh,
to pasture management and plant ID, which are really good. So if
oh,
that's
great.
something that you're interested in, go ahead and click those.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. There are lots. I actually considered putting in some of the digital resources, and maybe I can send those out later. There's some really great online for people who are interested in Plant ID. There's some really great online resources that can help with that. The iPhone actually is really good. I don't know if the Android phones have the same function, but if you take a picture of a plant with your iPhone and you just swipe up, you can look up the plant and you can usually get close, but you do have to be a little discerning and discriminatory. Like, are you really correct, iPhone? So don't assume it's correct, but often you can get kind of close that way if you're really curious about a specific species. So anyway, if anyone's interested, we can send out some links to some of the digital resources for plant ID. But okay, so Grant, um, two questions, and I'll give them to you together, but I'm happy to repeat myself. What are some vegetation types you have grazed, and how do you balance livestock impacts to meet the goals of the project? And I know you've touched on some of that already, so feel free to skip if you need to.
So are we talking just like out in the open, or are we gonna focus like more on the fire grazing situation?
Um, so I think you talked a little bit about stuff out in the open, so let's talk about the other one.
Okay. Okay, so in like the cover crop situation, they've got all kinds of stuff. Everybody's got a cover crop mix, and most everything that they put in there, is good stuff. The biggest issue that we find a lot of times in our area, like if we're grazing a cover crop in a walnut orchard, for example, they they go through and they'll eat that cover crop back. They'll eat it pretty tight. Well, then you get to that late spring push, and what is left is back to your whole ice cream analogy. What is left is, well, I don't know what the actual name, but I call it rip gut. Everybody I know calls it rip gut. It's the only thing that's kind of left back on that first pass. They don't want to eat it because it's kind of got a bitter taste to it. So then on that second pass, you're kind of up against a wall, getting that out of the system. Well, then is what we find is over time, if you're making, two passes through those same orchards year after year after year, and that pretty soon that rip gut really gets established because we've left we've tripled the amount of competition that it has over everything else. And so there's some orchards where they were really good kind of clover orchards, and that wasn't like a cover crop. That was just, pasture ground that they'd put into orchards, and the clover would grow 2.5 feet tall out there every year. Well, slowly after going through there, we've just about gotten the clover out. The only thing that's left is the rip gut. So now we're back to a timing issue. Now we've got to be in there early enough to where we can get it before it really goes bitter, or starts to get ahead on it. Same thing with the cheeseweed. Cheeseweed will choke everything out. So those are kind of difficult to deal with. On the fire grazing thing, the biggest challenge for me is Medusa head and uh, Medusa head and oats, the wild oats. Because everybody who wants you to come in and do fire grazing doesn't want to pay you to do two passes. They want you to show up late in the season and take everything down to the dirt. Well, once the Medusa head is pushed, and once the oats are 3.5, 4 foot tall, and they got a stalk like to the size of your thumb, they're that's hard to get rid of. So kind of getting people lined out on the timing of it is crucial for what I'm doing. And most people are pretty receptive. Like, they get it once you explain it to them. But a lot of people who own these properties don't know it until you point it out to them. You know, I had a guy last year on a job, and he's like, "Man, you guys you're leaving all this back here. That we can't eat it. Like the sheep won't eat it. It's like a bale of straw, man." And I said, if you would have allowed me to come in here earlier and clean this up, and then I could go do a second kind of touch up pass, you know, we could work on a price here, and we can actually be successful. Instead of paying me money at the end and being disappointed, let's figure out a compromise to where your money is well spent. It might cost you $5 more, but you're going to be 100% happy. You know, so those are the kind of things that I've struggled with, but I think we're getting there just through education.
Great. Yes. So the sheep, well, you can't make the sheep eat things, right? We can encourage them to eat
Right,
things
right.
broccoli, but
And you know, cattle would make a better improvement on that, but most of these jobs are in a situation where I can't run cattle over the top, because I could run 500 cows over the top of that and turn it all into dust tomorrow. But that's not a reality for most of these situations.
right,
Hey,
right.
Grant, there was a question. Is there a reason that they don't want you to come in earlier? And it like, is it the perception of regrowth happening or what is that?
Yeah, it's 99.9% the regrowth factor. Everybody's worried that if I come in too early and then I take off and we get a late rain, it's going to push again. And we've seen it. I mean, it's happened. Happens every year on the ranches that I manage, and I do that on purpose. So they want the rains to be done. They want that grass to all be done growing before they really want us to come in there. So really, is all they're doing is they're making it harder for me to do my job, because now my sheep don't have the nutritional value coming out of that. So now I've got to supplement them. So now I got to charge them more, you know, and it's hotter. I got to haul more water. I got a higher risk of fire. Starting the fire myself, I'm getting paid to try and mitigate the fire risk, but yet I have the risk of starting a fire while I'm out there. So I think just communicating with the landowners and educating the landowners is going to be really helpful for everybody getting started on your first year doing a job. Don't commit to things that just don't work is kind of my theory. Like, somebody approached me the other day about a job that just was not going to work the way they had it in mind, and I'd rather not have it. If they'll change the goals just a little bit where it aligns with my goal, we can make it happen. And like I say, I can do a second pass way cheaper than just going in there at the end and doing it poorly. So, but yeah, their concern is typically regrowth.
Thanks, Grant. I have one more question, maybe for both of you. I may have missed it, but when is the best time to graze wild oats? I have a mix of wild oats and ripgut, but also native perennials like purple needlegrass.
I personally, I get in on the oats as quick as I can. I get in on the oats pretty early, but where I'm at, I have quite a bit of access to like clover country. So I'll go down and I'll hit those oats early, because once they get later in the year, they get rank and they're going to grow back behind me. I'm not going to get rid of them. I'm just going to try and get the most value out of them, days on feed, really, on those ranches. So I want to be on the oats, you know, when it's young and tender and just pushing, before it really gets stocky at all. If you see oat heads on the top, you kind of miss the boat a little bit. You got to just stomp it down and hope to eat as many pounds as you possibly can at that point. It'll be still really good cow feed. But I try to get on it really early, you know, when it just looks like a grass, you know, maybe 6 inches tall. Go in there and take it tight. And usually the clover will kind of rebound underneath it, because if you don't get it opened up, it'll choke out all your clovers and it'll choke out anything else that's growing in there. So if you take it down tight, and this is all my opinion, I'm no plant specialist here, but if you take it down tight, then it opens it up, and then your clovers can kind of choke it back a little bit. Same with your vetch. Once your vetch gets established, then you're kind of winning as far as feed value, and it's still going to grow back. So move on to move on to your other feeds later on in the season and just kind of be done with that. Maybe hit it again later if you can, but I wouldn't focus on it at that point.
Yeah, that's great, Grant. I think that's a really good perspective. I have a little more of a cattle background on this. But what I have heard is that the cattle come in, and when those oats and ripgut are like Grant said, they're still in that sort of green vegetative stage, right? There's no seed heads on them yet. They're still pretty good and they're really tasty, and the cattle will actually select for those instead of the purple needle grass. And they'll just leave the purple needle grass alone. They just like it better. And so that actually gives, like Grant lives in a really cool area of the state that has clover. We don't have a lot of clover here. We're just too dry. But what it does is it opens up, it actually reduces the competition for the needle grass and other native species, right? When you reduce some of the cover for the annual grass, thin it out a little bit, then the perennial grass species that you might really want there, um, have a little bit more of a chance. But like I said, that's kind of a cattle perspective. I don't know, Dan, if you can chime in if you have anything else to say about grazing in purple needlegrass.
I was just typing that in the chat. My experience with it is grazing it early, um, and then letting it go to seed, and then grazing it late seems to be a pretty good strategy. So I've had success grazing it like in March when we're lambing, and then not coming back to it until July or August when it's already set seed and drop seed, and um, it's not terribly palatable at that point, but it doesn't seem to hurt it to put sheep on it at that time frame either.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. Okay. Um, Another question for Grant. How do you know when to move the livestock to meet the desired objectives for each project? And I know we talked about that a little bit with the orchard grass and the alfalfa, but maybe if I don't know if you have anything else to add to some of those thoughts.
So on like a fire grazing job, obviously the goal is to take it tight. But at the same time, we've got to look after our livestock. So we add the supplements and everything, but on those jobs where the feed is more poor value or no value, but we still got to eat it, we still got to run it through the sheep, we still got to turn it into a pellet form on the ground, is what I'm doing is I'm supplementing my sheep with something that they can survive on, and I'm moving them quicker. So I'm putting them in tighter cells and moving fast. I'll move 2 or 3 times a day if I need to. So that way they're getting a fresh chance to eat something good in there. And we're not starving them off of the goodie for 3 or 4 days at a time. I got my guys moving those sheep 2, maybe 3 times a day if needed, but they're in a tight area. So they're breaking more of that plant material down, putting it back into the dirt just with hoof action. And they're eating whatever they can at a higher rate and moving on. So that's how I manage that on those really poor jobs. Most of the jobs, I'd say it's probably a 60% good forage in there that has some value to it, even if it's dry late in the season. The fillery, they'll eat the fillery as dust off the ground and still gain weight if there's enough of it. The burr clovers, they'll get in there and start eating the burr clover and working on that. And so as long as there's enough of that to kind of keep them going, they'll still run a certain amount of that trash through them. But the Medusa head and things like that, just in course of eating what they can, they're stomping that into the dirt, and we're moving on. But you just can't build too big of an area and leave them too long, because they'll trick you and it'll look like there's stuff out there. You're not getting the job done for the contract, and you're not helping your sheep or goats at all. So I also try to build my cells creatively. If the edge of where I need to be, say it's a 300-yard perimeter around a ranch, and there's some poison oak in 350 yards, I'm going to do that extra 50 yards. I'm going to do it for free just so they got a little bit of green going into their stomach because uh, 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 Dr. Bush, he talked quite a bit about the rumen health and things at some different deals I've gone to. And, the rumen health is pretty important. So we've got to take care of that. So by maybe supplementing a little bit with alfalfa or giving them something green in there, that's just kind of what I'm doing. I guess I'm rambling at this point, but carry on.
No, that's good, Grant. I was just thinking that, Morgan talked about it a little bit last week, and I mentioned, well, he talked about it last week, and I just reminded everyone this week that one of the reasons cattle can handle some of that low quality forage is because they have a larger rumen. Well, that's the reason that you have to be so careful with your sheep is they have a smaller rumen and they just can't process as much low quality forage. So that was really, really helpful. Thank you. Um, I just have like, I don't know, maybe one or two more slides and then we'll hear from Grant some more and we're just about done. It's 7:15. Um, yeah, I think we'll be done right on time. So that's good news. I just wanted to share some of what I have heard and learned about grazing and crop settings, experience-wise. In almond orchards, the sheep will eat the bark of young trees. That tends to happen when they've been left in an orchard too long. So all the ice cream plants are gone, and they're looking at that broccoli, and the almond tree looks better. Um, so in some cases, they will strip the almond bark. It's something to be aware of. In an orchard like this, you can actually see the irrigation lines are strapped up in the trees. So this orchard's already ready to go for sheep where they can't really step on them. In some orchards, the irrigation lines are buried, so they don't really step on them. But sometimes those irrigation lines aren't buried that deep and they will pop up. But also with buried irrigation lines, you have vertebrate pest concerns. So when the ground cover is this high, it can be really hard to know where gophers are, and then it's really hard to control them without standing basically on top of an active gopher mound. And so it's pretty easy for gophers to kind of get out of control in situations like that. So it's something that the almond farmer is balancing, right? If they're interested in cover crops, they want to have that as part of their orchard management, but what are they going to do about vertebrate pests? And then in pistachios, they do like pistachio bark. I've heard about it definitely more in young trees, but pistachio bark just tends to be thinner, and they will eat it if they don't have something else to eat. Mostly what I've heard. So I know some people will graze the sheep, the cover crop in it like a pistachio orchard, but I also know of some research being done where the sheep are eating the pistachio mummies. So they'll all the nuts that weren't harvested need to come off the trees and they'll be shaken off or sometimes they're beaten off with sticks to make sure that all the mummies come down. And then they'll be like windrowed or piled up in the row middles. And the sheep can come through and eat those mummies and they do really well on them. They eat the whole thing. Um, and they'll leave the pistachios alone. So it's definitely possible to graze in pistachio orchards, but things to be aware of. In alfalfa fields, we talked a lot about that, so I'm not really going to go into it anymore. Um, but then in vineyards, um, most vineyards, the grazing occurs before bud break. So basically, once the vines start to push those green shoots and buds, the sheep think those are better than ice cream. I don't know what is better than ice cream, but that's what it is for the sheep, and they will just eat all those really important shoots for the grape growers, and that's bad, obviously. Um, so the sheep always need to come out before bud break. And I've heard of a few, and I don't think it's super common, but I've heard of a few vineyards that have raised their trellises where the vines are out of the reach of the sheep, in which case the sheep are able to stay longer. I think in some cases they can even stay year round or close to that. They can stay a lot longer is the point. And so there's a benefit for vineyard owners who are really interested in incorporating sheep long term in their vineyard. Did you have something to add, Allison?
Um, I I was just gonna say we did quite a bit of grazing in vineyards and we had raised trellises and I just would caution folks who are taking vineyard contracts not to promise that that will stop the sheep because they're really good at getting up on their hind legs and eating those new buds.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Are there any questions or anything that I can address? We've got like, I don't know, 2 or 3 slides left.
We had a couple comments. Dan was saying he had good success grazing Medusa head in the fall. They need to provide protein, but it's easier to break that thatch up in the fall. And then Dylan said he was in Paso Robles today and saw the grazing in a vineyard. Looked cool. A lot of cover crop underneath there.
Awesome. Great. Okay, so you talked about how the sheep will get look up and get what they can. So I just wanted to show this video. I took this video in an almond orchard, and that sheep you can see is very interested in chewing on that almond tree. Um, but in this case, this particular farmer is okay with it. Basically, they kind of have to be trimmed up anyway, so the sheep help with that. And in regards to like eating some of the blooms, he's not worried about that either. So the sheep will look up, they will browse for sure. I have evidence of it. We know they do it. Just wanted to show that quick video. Um, okay. Um, Grant talked about that already, so I won't make him do that again. Okay, Grant, what are some benefits of grazing you have observed on your grazing projects? And I know you mentioned a little bit like with the alfalfa, but I didn't know if there's something else you might be able to share.
What was the first part of that? I got the last part.
Yeah. So what are some benefits of grazing you have observed on your grazing projects? And what I said is that I know we talked about the benefits of grazing in alfalfa, but I didn't know if you have anything else you could share.
Yeah, other than the obvious, grazing, we make pounds of beef and lamb. As far as working in the cover crops and things like that, we're building the biology in the soil. We're getting all these bugs going together and everything working together. And we're building an ecosystem, right? And so there's a couple farmers who I've been working with a little bit. We don't have any proof on it yet, but the theory is that we're going to build their soil, and they're fresh fruit farmers. So figs and dates, and things, or not dates, but prunes. So the theory is those are all sold and judged, in my understanding of this, by like your sugar content. Well, their theory is that by grazing and building better soil and building a better ecosystem in their orchards, that they're going to raise their sugar content, and that makes a lot of sense to me. And then that's gonna add some direct value. So it's going to cut costs on the mowing passes and any potential herbicides, which most of these guys are kind of thinking more organic anyway. So if they can cut costs on the mowing side of things and still get a gain by having a more desirable product in the fruit, if any of this is real, take it for what it's worth. I'll give you a refund on what you paid to be here. So that's the theory there, and I see a huge benefit in that if we could prove it. But so far, it's just a theory. So those are the things that I see kind of coming down the line, is guys wanting to look at the next step. We're all just trying to cut the mowing costs out and build that soil, but is there a yield advantage? Is there a quality advantage coming off the backside? We know that there's a quality advantage and a reduced herbicides and pesticides in the alfalfa side, because that's easy to prove. Whereas with the trees and the cover crop and the fresh fruit, that's going to take a little bit more time because they're going to have to do, sugar tests over 5 years. So if that addressed your question, I sure hope it did.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
Grant, we have another question. Dan was saying that he's also finding sheep and goats will graze small conifers in the timberlands. And the question is, would you ever say no to a job, and why?
Absolutely. I would totally, I would say no to a job yesterday because I did. Yeah, I mean, there's certain expectations that some people come up with and build in their mind that are just not realistic. Well, why? So it's a bigger thing. It's not just going in there and failing and potentially going broke yourself. It's also an industry thing. And I think that everybody who's going into these grazing jobs needs to be looking at the world a little bit more like that. Like, everybody's trying to cut each other's throat and try and get this job away from the other guy and what have you. But at the same time, if one guy goes in there and does something stupid and gets it on camera and it gets blown all over the computer, pretty soon this industry's got a big black eye on it. We don't need that. We need to be really professional and recognize when a ship can sink and be out in front of that. And that's just me talking. I'm sorry if I'm being rude, but I see sometimes people take a job that there's no way that that's going to work. They're going to starve those sheep. They're going to be right next to a highway where everybody's watching it. They're going to prove that their sheep can't do a very good job. And then we lose all of the people in that area for potential clients or customers, because they just saw it not work over there. And, it's same with the alfalfa. There's an area up here north of me where nobody really remembers when the last time sheep were in there. It was probably 1963, but somebody ruined an alfalfa field somehow, according to legend. And everybody just keeps telling that story, and none of those guys will open it up to sheep because great grandpa said that sheep ruined a field one time. Well, then they come right down across the highway and we haven't ruined a field yet. So, there's those stories stick with you a long time. And I think we got to be really, thinking about that. And if a job is set up for failure, why go out there and lose the money just to say you have a job? Lose the money or lose your sheep or put a bad taste in their mouth to where you're not going to have a chance to get those neighbors. Go do another job next door that you can be successful at. And maybe they'll kind of change what they're hoping to get out of it. I guess just show them what does work and don't be afraid to say no. I mean, in this time with sheep being what they are and the herders costing what they do and fuel being $6.50 a gallon. Yeah, we're all trying to scrape it out and do what we can, but I can stay home and lose money. Why am I going to put $30,000 of freight on these sheep to go lose money? I'd rather not.
Totally agree. Do you find that most folks, if they're just, it's their first job with you or they're trying to contract with you, do you find them to be pretty receptive if you have, say their timing is off and it's not going to work because of that, or, whatever the invasive plant they want to get rid of? Are they pretty receptive?
Yeah. Most of them are. I've got one guy right now. I told him that his expectations were a little bit high, and I didn't really like his plan. I made another suggestion. He didn't like my suggestion, yet he calls me every single day, and he kind of drives me crazy about it because he's sure that what he wants done is going to work, but I keep explaining to him that it's not, and I'm not going to lose money, but for the right price, I'll come over there and prove to him that it won't work, but he better not put the blame on me. And it's in a way that it's not going to compromise my livestock. It's just going to be a huge waste of money. But he's one of those guys. He's got the mindset that he's right about everything, and so he's going to be pushing it. I got another guy over there who is apprehensive. He's a little bit less. I don't know. He's a little bit more timid, and so I try to change some things on his plan, and he's coming around, but he needs time to think about it. It's taking him time to process because this is all new to him, which is okay. Like, if you need a week or two, or if we want to talk about this all year until your mind gets wrapped around what I'm saying, and we'll actually put sheep on the job next year, that's cool too. I don't want to rush into it until he's ready for it and he understands what we're getting out of it. But most people, within 45 minutes of standing in the field, if you just walk out and stand in the grass with them, you can explain it. Most of them don't understand range, and they don't understand grasses, and a lot of them don't even really understand, the livestock. So if you walk out there into the field that they're wanting you to work in and just point to it, show them, look at this. This is the size of a number 2 pencil. It's not going to work. Or this mustard. This mustard is right now a stalk the size of my arm. It's not going to get clean. It's not reality. If I was here 3 weeks ago when it was still small and they could chew that off, we'd have a clean project. But now we've waited too long, so your expectations just aren't a reality. But when they're standing there looking at it and you whack that thing with a stick and it won't break, they're like, oh, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. But when they drive by it at 70 miles an hour in their F-250, it's really hard to get that across.
Excellent. Thank you, Grant. We are almost at time, so let me see. I think I had one more question. What are some challenges you have faced when managing grazing in crop settings?
Managing grazing in crop settings.
Yes,
so
challenges.
Back to like the alfalfa and things like that. Those are kind of the crops, if I'm understanding crops correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Or are we talking like orchards too?
Any orchards, any sort of farming
Okay.
setting.
The biggest challenge that I have with grazing the crops has been, like when we go and we graze the alfalfa fields and those things. I work with my farmers to where I coordinate with their spray teams. So as I'm moving through that country, I'm coordinating with the sprayers, and we've got to have fence picked up, we've got to have sheep moved, and we've got to do it in a manner to where the spray crews don't stop. That's challenging because we're talking about thousands of acres of orchard grass and alfalfa simultaneously, and I've got to make sure, like, I'm no farmer, but I've somehow got into a position where I've got to be involved in that. But they're really good people, and they're a really professional company, and we make it work, and we've done it enough years to where it's kind of seamless. But there's days where he wants to spray a field, and I'm not done cleaning it up, and I just can't make those sheep move any faster. So where, like, in a lot of farmers who are in agriculture, they have a calendar and a clock, and they set things by it because that's easy to do. You can go start your tractor when you want, you can shut it off when you want, but you can't really make sheep eat 24 hours a day. He drives by his field at 2 in the afternoon and they're all bedded down asleep, and he wants to spray that field tomorrow, and they're sleeping and they're not eating. He's like, come on, you gotta go wake these sheep up. I'm like, dude, they need a siesta, they've been out all day. So, those kinds of things are challenging. That and like you said, browsing on trees in the orchards, that's kind of a challenge. But with management and everybody getting aligned in their expectations, it's all doable. But then I will also mention that we're discussing how different trees are more ice cream for these sheep. That's absolutely true. But we've also got to think about there's a lot of different varieties of sheep, and not very often do I hear anybody mention that. Everybody's like, oh, we got there's sheep in a vineyard. Well, what kind of sheep? Because there's a lot of different kinds of sheep, and they perform differently. Like there's a job that I have right now that I had to call another producer in to work on because his sheep don't tend to really eat brush. They're never in brush, so they never think to look up. They haven't adapted to look up. My sheep, They go up to Modoc in the summer, and we're living on nothing but brush. There's no ground feed. It's solid bitter brush as far as you can see, and they're working on that. So my sheep are like up all the time, and I can't go into that orchard because they're really short trees, and I'm gonna nuke that whole thing. I tried my sheep. They lasted a week, and then we couldn't get them out fast enough. But then, so you just kind of got to match that and be aware of it. Like on fire grazing jobs, he he likes calling me up and see if I got any extra sheep laying around because my sheep tend to eat a little ranker stuff. Breed is a lot to do with it, and the environment that they grow up in, I think, has a lot to do with it. Dan might think that I'm completely insane when I'm saying this, but I genuinely believe that. So those things kind of need to be factored in also when we're looking at what could be the challenge of this job for somebody who's getting into it. You know, are you getting a kind of sheep that tends to want to look up, or are you getting a kind of sheep that can't ever look up because it's only 2 foot tall to begin with? You know, there's different varieties that you can play with.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Grant. You're absolutely right. The breed of sheep and also their experience and what they have eaten is very important. Um, so we are pretty much done. I just wanted to leave you with a photo of a carefully managed and grazed riparian area. Um, and just keeping in mind the art and science, I tried to balance the two tonight, talk about some of the science behind grazing and let Grant really cover some of the practical art of putting animals on the ground and finding ways to have them achieve specific goals. If you're interested in any additional resources, the Targeted Grazing Handbook Chapter 2 talks a lot about species selection. For anyone grazing in brush or chaparral, we do have a couple of publications with more information on that. Just talking about, tannins in the brush and nutrition and things like that. And then kind of back to the science side, knowing when to move livestock, there is a way to measure how many pounds are present per acre. And this video is like 20 minutes long, but you could probably sort through the important parts. Um, and I think the important thing is that in this video, they're measuring RDM. They're measuring how much is left at the end of the growing season, but the same concept can be applied to measuring how much forage is there to eat. And it's just a matter of what are you considering forage? And that's going to vary based on maybe your species or maybe the project or the goal. So anyway, for those getting started, if you're not quite sure what's out there and how long you can be there, we do have ways to help with that. And if there are any questions, we can take them now. And we will send out the recording as well. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. But Allison, is there anything in the chat? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Just a comment from Dylan who said he met one of the workers at Tablas Creek Vineyard in Paso Robles that have their own sheep operation on the premises, and there's a link to that.
Oh, great. Excellent. So yeah, so there's some links in the chat if you guys are interested. I'll leave this up for like a minute so you can copy and paste those. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation. Grant, thank you so much for taking some time out of your
Yeah.
family evening at the hockey game. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, you bet. Hopefully I said something that somebody can get some value out of.
Absolutely, you did. No question.
All right. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Thank you, Allison, for all your help. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Grant.
Okay. All right, well, thanks everyone, and we will see you next week.